They bombed a human colony for obedience, and for 12 full days humanity answered with nothing. No declaration, no threat, no plea for justice. Just silence, so complete it seemed to drain the heat from every chamber in the Galactic Concord. The first recordings from Morrow's wake were still circulating when the panic began. The colony had been small by interstellar standards, barely 180,000 souls, spread across a cold ocean world under 3 domed cities and a ring of agricultural stations. It had no battle fleet, no fortress grid, no strategic importance worth a major war. What it did have was a harbor full of refugees from the Feskar Dominion, labor caste families who had crossed the frontier in stolen freighters and begged for asylum under human law. Morrow's wake had taken them in, fed them, registered them, protected them, and when the Dominion demanded their return as property, the human governor sent back a single line: "There are no slaves here." The answer came from orbit. The Feskar had ruled sectors of space since before humans learned to split the atom. Their fleets were older than many species' written histories. Their doctrine was simple and brutal. Order existed because disobedience was punished visibly, immediately, and without mercy. The Dominion did not merely defeat enemies, it made examples of them. Worlds were not conquered to gain resources. They were disciplined so that other worlds would never dream of resistance. That was why the bombardment was public. Legate Sar Vek of the Dominion's 7th Ascendancy opened a channel to the entire frontier and delivered his ultimatum in a voice like grinding stone. Surrender all refugee assets. Dissolve human militia authority. Kneel to Dominion inspection. Compliance would spare the colony. Refusal would instruct the region. The governor of Morrow's wake, Elena Ward, stood in a narrow operations room with emergency lights flickering red across her face and said no again. Her final transmission was not grand. It was tired, steady, and very human. She said the shelters were full of children. She said the hospitals were marked. She said there was still time to back away from murder. Sar Vek ordered fire. The first kinetic strikes took the orbital docks. The second wave cracked Dome 2 from crown to foundation, venting half a district into blackness while medics were still running stretchers through the corridor locks. Then the Dominion did something even the Concord later struggled to explain. They targeted the seawall generators around Dome 1 and let an Arctic Ocean do what remained. Live emergency channels filled the network with screams, static, rushing water, and the flat mechanical voices of failing life support systems. The last clear image transmitted from the colony was a line of school children in silver thermal blankets being herded through smoke while the sky above them burned white. 73,000 died in the first hour. The Galactic Concord went into immediate emergency session, but outrage in the Concord was a ritual, not a weapon. Speeches were made. Observers denounced excessive force. Delegates from old client species lowered their eyes and said nothing at all. Everyone expected humanity to explode. The species had a reputation by then. Too intense, too emotional, brilliant traders, dangerous engineers, quick to laugh, quicker to bleed. They were respected on the frontier and dismissed at the center. An ambitious middle power with a talent for surviving and an irritating habit of treating all sapients as if dignity mattered more than protocol. So the Dominion expected rage. The Concord expected rage. The markets expected rage. Frontier militias armed for rage. Instead, the human delegation seats went empty. Their embassy lights went dark on every capital station within 6 hours of the attack. Human merchant traffic ceased within 9. Civilian data streams from Sol, Luna, Mars, and the outer colonies shrank to automated navigation pings and weather notices. Their diplomats vanished behind sealed compounds. Their military frequencies stopped broadcasting. Even the usual flood of human media, the endless arguments, songs, dramas, debates, disappeared as if someone had taken a blade to the galaxy's noise. By the second day, it no longer felt like mourning. It felt like preparation. The Dominion laughed at first. Their ministers said the younger species had lost its nerve. Their admirals declared the silence proof of strategic paralysis. A few even praised Sar Vec for demonstrating proper imperial resolve. When trade indices dipped and frontier insurance rates tripled, the Dominion's high voice addressed the Concord and warned all members against romantic attachment to inferior legal fictions such as asylum. He called Morrow's wake an administrative correction. He said humans would either learn restraint or become the next lesson. That speech was carried to every inhabited system. No one heard back from Earth. Then, the first Theskar convoy vanished. It was a fuel train moving through the Nerex corridor under destroyer escort, a standard military resupply chain, so routine that the ship's internal logs were mostly complaints about ration quality and reactor maintenance. Mid-transit, every vessel simultaneously dropped beacon contact. No distress call, no battle report, no debris field large enough to explain annihilation. Search ships found only drifting cargo modules opened with surgical precision, their fuel cells removed, their crews gone. And one message burned across the hull of the lead escort with industrial cutting torches. Morrow's wake account opened. The Theskar dismissed it as piracy until a listening post near the frontier lost power, with all 27 technicians still seated at their stations, dead from vacuum exposure, because every emergency door in the complex had opened at once. A day later, an Ascendancy Customs citadel suffered a reactor cascade after maintenance drones turned on the garrison. Then, a military archive on Velsar Prime erupted in blue flame when its supposedly isolated data vaults were overwritten with evacuation maps from the destroyed colony, including the names of children confirmed dead beneath Dome 1. It was not random. That was the part that frightened people. Nothing civilian was touched. Markets kept trading, habitat rings kept spinning, agricultural worlds kept receiving fertilizer and medical shipments. Human retaliation moved like a blade through nerves and arteries, never hacking wildly, always cutting only what kept the Dominion powerful. Fuel, logistics, sensor nets, command relays, shipyards, codes. Officers who had signed bombardment authorizations, admirals who had defended the massacre on record, woke to sealed compartments venting into empty space. A procurement minister suffered a fatal airlock malfunction while reading casualty projections he had helped falsify. Every death was impossible. Every death was deliberate. And still, humanity did not speak. By the fourth day, fear had spread beyond Theskar space. The old empires understood war. They understood fleets, blockades, mobilization, rhetoric, ultimatums, all the recognizable signals of violence. This was something else. A species had suffered an atrocity, and instead of lashing out, it had become unreadable. Human military doctrine, once mocked as too decentralized and too dependent on initiative, suddenly looked less like improvisation and more like a camouflage pattern nobody had bothered to study. Then the Concord learned what the silence was hiding. Across human space, every public square, station concourse, mining tunnel chapel, orbital tram port, and naval dockyard had filled with people standing absolutely still. Not rioting, not chanting, standing. For 1 hour each local night cycle, they said nothing. Parents held photographs. Veterans wore dress blacks. Children stood beside empty shoes arranged in rows. On Luna, 5 million people gathered beneath the transparent roofs of Mare Serenitatis and did not make a sound. On Mars, work crews shut down entire foundries to join the vigil. In the shipyards over Callisto, welders left sparks dying on unfinished hulls and saluted toward the stars where Morrow's wake had been. The silence was not confusion, it was grief under discipline. That realization came too late for Sar-Vek. The legate had been elevated to hero status after the bombardment and granted command of a punitive task force intended to stabilize nearby human settlements. He entered the Kepri Drift with 21 warships, expecting frightened colonists and improvised resistance. Instead, his long-range scouts found abandoned stations, empty fuel caches, and navigation beacons broadcasting outdated maps. He pressed deeper anyway, unwilling to appear hesitant before subordinates he had trained to worship decisiveness. At the edge of the drift, every star in his tactical display went out. Not literally. That was the terror of it. His sensors still showed the system, but the predictive grid that Theskar battle doctrine depended on, the web of beacons, telemetry points, reference buoys, and synchronized fleet markers that turned battle into mathematics, had been replaced by ghosts. Hundreds of false signatures bloomed, gravity reports contradicted themselves, targeting solutions drifted by fractions so small a human eye might have missed them, but enough to ruin every firing sequence in the Ascendancy manuals. When Sar-Vek ordered a course correction, 3 of his escorts collided before command relays could update. Then the human ships arrived with no emissions and no warning. They did not emerge in parade formation. They appeared where the Theskar believed no ship could be, inside blind cones, beneath sensor horizons, gliding like pieces of night given engines. Their hulls were dark, unlit, scarred by dust and micrometeor pitting from long, silent travel. No battle anthem played on open frequencies. No admiral demanded surrender. Their first salvo was not aimed at bridges or reactors, but at the external sensor vanes and communication spines of every Theskar vessel in range. The punitive task force went deaf in under 11 seconds. Sar-Vek tried to run. He managed one jump calculation before his flagship's drives shut down from a virus that had been seeded into Dominion navigation firmware 3 years earlier through a civilian subcontractor nobody had ever audited. Human Marines cut into his command deck 22 minutes later. They did not execute him. They did not even strike him after he spat on their insignia. They strapped him into a crash couch, sedated him, and shipped him alive to the Galactic Concord with the full, unedited records of Morrow's wake downloaded into the chamber systems before anyone could stop them. The trial that followed was the moment the galaxy stopped smirking at humanity. Sar-Vek expected a show trial, rage, public vengeance. What he got was worse. The humans presented no theatrical prosecutor, no pounding of desks, no patriotic speeches. They simply played the colony recordings in sequence, with timestamps, internal Dominion command traffic, weapons telemetry, and authenticated voice prints. The chamber heard Elena Ward refuse to surrender refugees. Heard a Theskar gunnery officer ask whether Dome 2 was confirmed civilian. Heard Sar-Vek answer, "That is why it will be remembered." Heard another officer recommend disabling infrastructure only, and the legate reply with the sentence that would follow the Dominion for the rest of its history. Burn the lesson deep enough, and the children will teach obedience to the survivors. There were no survivors in Dome 2. When the playback ended, the Concord chamber remained silent for nearly a minute. Not because procedure required it, because nobody could move. The old powers had committed atrocities before. Some in that very room had ordered them. But there was something about hearing the lines spoken over the sounds of children crying and bulkheads failing that made the usual diplomatic language collapse under its own cowardice. The Dominion delegation tried to challenge authenticity. Then their own internal seals were verified. They tried to argue local military necessity. Then human rescue teams released imagery showing refugee shelters marked exactly according to Concord protection law. They tried to reduce the death toll. Then the names began to scroll across the chamber walls, tens of thousands of them, each linked to biometric and census records. There was no room left for denial. And in that moment, humanity finally spoke. Not to the Dominion, to the Concord. The human representative who took the floor was an elderly woman in plain black, with no medals visible and no detectable tremor in her voice. She did not shout. She did not threaten war. She said that the dead of Morrow's wake were under the protection of human law and had been murdered after requesting mercy. She said every officer who enabled that crime would be found. She said every military capability used to make such crimes possible would be dismantled. She said humanity would not target civilian populations, would not ask other species to bleed in its place, and would not stop because of discomfort, cost, or diplomatic inconvenience. Then she said the line that made even Allied delegates go cold. We have concluded that the Dominion cannot be persuaded to behave like a civilization. Therefore, we will reduce its ability to choose otherwise. After that, the war changed shape. Until then, the Dominion had imagined it was facing a wounded regional rival acting out of grief. What it discovered instead was a species that had spent a century being underestimated and had used every second of it to prepare for exactly the kind of empire that believed cruelty was strength. Human commerce had mapped Dominion shipping deeper than Dominion intelligence had ever realized. Human engineers had sold them efficiency upgrades with invisible backdoors. Human medical exchanges had built relief networks in vassal states that were now quietly feeding resistance cells. Human entertainment companies, dismissed for decades as soft cultural noise, had carried language packs, encrypted folklore, and covert broadcast tools into worlds the Concord barely remembered existed. The silence had not been empty. It had been a switch being flipped. In 70 hours, 12 Dominion frontier sectors lost synchronized command. Slave processing camps were exposed and overrun by local uprisings coordinated through human ghost channels. Fuel depots detonated only after evacuation warnings transmitted in the native languages of labor castes the Dominion had never bothered to respect. Prison worlds woke to find their orbital jammers gone and human hospital ships already descending through the clouds. The galaxy watched ancient banners fall from capitals that had seemed eternal, not because humanity had conquered them directly, but because it had cut away the fear that held them together. The high voice of the Dominion answered with fury. A grand fleet was assembled above the fortress world of Thescara, the largest military concentration seen in 2 generations. 206 warships, siege carriers, planet-breaker lances, veteran command crews bred into obedience across centuries. The high voice believed, as tyrants often do, that scale itself was destiny. If he could crush the human main fleet in a single public battle, the myth would die. The uprisings would fade, the silence would end in humiliation. So he announced the location and demanded Earth come burn with him. Earth did come. Or rather, that was what everyone thought when human fleet groups began converging on the Thescara approach in visible force for the first time since the war began. The feeds showed carriers, missile cruisers, armored escorts, all marked with the clean, dark geometry of Saul's navy. At last, observers said, a conventional battle. At last, a test of mass and firepower. Dominion admirals smiled again. Numbers still meant something. Old metal still mattered. Then the human line stopped just outside lance range and held position. For 43 minutes, nothing happened. The Dominion took that pause for hesitation. The high voice delivered another speech. He mocked human morality. He thanked them for assembling targets in one place. He promised their defeat would re-establish natural order in the stars. While he spoke, Dominion fire control systems quietly updated against the stationary human wall. What they did not know was that the fleet facing them was only half the knife. During the silence, human deep-range units had been doing what the galaxy once considered impossible. Moving capital ships through the grave-dark volume above the ecliptic, months off the standard trade planes, with engines throttled so low they disappeared into background radiation. They had arrived around Thescara 3 days earlier. They had seeded autonomous mines inside the exits of military jump lanes. They had hacked the Fortress Moon's defense clocks by 19 milliseconds. They had boarded and captured 3 relay stations without firing a shot. When the High Voice gave the order to open fire, nothing on the Dominion side happened the way it should have. Half the lances refused to charge because their safety governors suddenly believed friendly ships were in the line. Missile racks cycled empty because their targeting architecture was flooded with valid command signatures from dead admirals. Formation screens broke as jump exits erupted behind them, and human strike groups came down from nowhere, hitting from vectors no doctrine covered. Then the mines bloomed inside the lane mouths, turning retreat corridors into expanding walls of shrapnel and plasma. The Grand Fleet had been positioned for a duel. Humanity had designed a collapse. The Battle of Thescara lasted less than an hour. The first 20 minutes belonged to confusion. The next 15 belonged to terror. In the last 20, the Dominion fleet ceased to exist as a coherent military body. Ships rammed one another trying to escape firing arcs that no longer mattered. Captains severed internal networks to stop human intrusion and went blind. Boarding alarms sounded across carriers before any hull breach was detected, because human infiltrators had hidden in supply modules weeks earlier. A dreadnought named Eternal Mandate tried to roll broadside toward the human decoy line and instead took rail strikes through its ventral spine from a battleship it had never seen. Still, humanity did not target the planet below. That restraint echoed louder than any weapon. Thescara's cities watched their masters lose in orbit, while human broadcasts flooded the surface in every registered language. Shelter coordinates, ceasefire procedures, medical frequency bands, surrender protections. Millions who had been taught for centuries that humans were unstable primitives saw something impossible. Total military dominance without massacre. Precision without mercy for the guilty. Mercy without weakness. The High Voice attempted to flee aboard a command courier as his fleet died around him. He made it 17,000 kilometers before his engines shut down. Human interceptors brought him back alive.